Egypt when the king of Egypt went through and Yoshiyahu tried to stop him.
Oh my God.
What's very clear is that Yoshiyahu reacts to the Reformation in different ways. The first way he reacts is, I think he hopes for reform, and he says there's always the possibility of return. And we've actually studied that. That's in chapter 18. Let's take a quick look at it. Chapter 18. It's the first 4 sentences. Page 125. Hadavar asher haya el Yirmiyahu me'et Adonai lemor. The word came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Kum v'yaradita bet hayotzer. This is a very important part of the book. Go down to the potter's house. V'shama ashmiyacha et devarai. And there you will hear my words. Va'ired bet hayotzer, and I went to the potter's house. V'hinei oseh malacha al ha'avnayim. And he was doing his work. V'nishchat hakli asher hu oseh b'chome b'yad hayotzer. And whatever he was shaping was at faults, v'shav v'yaseu kli acher. He remolded it and reshaped it. Kasher yashav be'einei hayotzer la'asot. And the Navi Yirmiyahu says, just as the potter could discard whatever the potter is creating that wasn't of a proper caliber and start anew, so too, Charles, let me get you a better chair. That chair is, you sure? So too, the children of Israel. There is hope. So on one level, when Yoshiyahu comes on the scene, Yirmiyahu thinks that maybe there can be a turnaround. That's always a cornerstone of the position of a prophet. That's number one. That's the Jeremiah who during the Reformation period hopes. The second is Jeremiah who during the Reformation period rebukes, because he looks at what's happening, and this is the way of the prophet. The prophet doesn't only see things from its externality, but is seeing it internally. That's a very delicate relationship between the king and the prophet. The king was the CEO, and the king has to worry about the way things look. And the king looked like a king. The prophet often walked around without shoes. The prophet wasn't dressed in 3-piece clothing, in suit and tie. The prophet looked internally and wanted to see whether what was happening had internal spiritual meaning. And when Yirmiyahu looks at what was happening on the one level, he felt good about it. But on the other level, he looked more deeply and he rebukes. And how does he rebuke? And there are 2 specific ways that he rebukes. The first is most interesting, and that is he rebukes as it relates to Jewish ritual, which is really fascinating. And you really can't study Yirmiyahu without looking at these sentences, because they, as you know, Shabbat is mentioned many times in the Torah and the Pentateuch, but it's not mentioned that often in many sentences in the prophets. But take a look at chapter 17, sentence 20, and that is on page 122. Ko Amar Adonai Elai. This is what Jeremiah says. Thus the Lord said unto me, Holoch ve'amadita b'sha'ar b'nei ha'am. Go and stand in the gate of the children of the people. Asher yavo'u vo malchei Yehuda va'asher yetz'u vo. Go to the gates where the kings of Judah come and go. V'chol sha'arei Yerushalayim. You know, the gates of Jerusalem there are many different gates leading into the old city. Va'amarta alehem, and you shall say to the people, God says to Jeremiah, say to the people, page 122, Shimu divar Adonai malchei Yehuda, v'chol Yehuda, v'chol yoshvei Yerushalayim. Listen closely, the rulers of Judah, and all of its citizenry, and all those who dwell in Yerushalayim, haba'im basha'arim ha'eleh, not only those who live in the city, but those who come into the gates. Ko amar Adonai, thus says the Lord, Yishamru b'nafshotechem. Take heed and protect your souls. HaShabbat, b'yom Yishamru b'nafshotechem, va'al tis'u masa b'yom HaShabbat. And do not carry any burden on the day of Shabbat. V'havetem b'sharei Yerushalayim, nor bring it into the gates of Jerusalem. What is the Navi doing? What is the prophet doing? The prophet is exhorting the people to observe the Shabbat. Here he seems to be saying, make sure not to carry on Shabbat. I want to read it through, and I want to get your reaction. This is not me speaking. This is Jeremiah speaking. It's right in the text. V'lo totziu masa mibatechem b'yom HaShabbat. Don't take out any burden from your home on the Sabbath. V'chol melacha lo ta'asu. Nor should you perform any chores on Shabbat. You're to hallow the Shabbat. V'kidashtem et yom HaShabbat. Sanctify the day of the Sabbath, kashetzi viti et avotechem, as I commanded your forefathers. V'lo shamu, but the people didn't listen. V'lo hitu et aznam, and they did not incline their ears. Vayakshu et arpam, and they stiffened the back of their necks. Lilviti shmoa ulevilti kachat musa, and they did not listen, and they did not receive any instructions. Quite fascinating.
We're in Am Yishayoref, aren't we?
V'haya im shemoa tishma'un, and the careful reader, when seeing this of course echoes the second paragraph of the Shema found in Sefer Dvarim. V'haya im shemoa tishma'un elai, and if you will hearken to me, Ne'um Adonai, saith the Lord, not to carry, or the Kadesh at Yom HaShabbat, and to sanctify the day of the Sabbath. The Kadesh means, there's stuff you're not supposed to do, but the Kadesh would be the affirmative principles, and to proactively sanctify the Sabbath. The Kiddush, the Shalom Aleichem, whatever there was in the time of Yirmiyahu, Livilti asot ba kol melacha, uva'u v'sharei ha'ir hazot. If you don't observe the Shabbat, they will come into the city. Melachim, rulers, v'sarim, and princes, yoshvim al kisei David. They will be riding on the throne of David, sitting upon the throne of David. Rochvim barechev uvasusim, hema v'sareim, Ish Yehuda. All of these foreign leaders will come into Yehuda, v'yoshvei Yerushalayim, v'yashva ha'ir hazot lavetach. This is the reverse. This is if you do listen. If you do listen, then all of the good things will happen. All of the leaders, all of the rulers will be in place. Uva'u me'arei Yehuda, u'misvivot Yerushalayim, u'me'eretz Binyamin, u'min ha'shvela, u'min ha'har, u'min ha'negev, miviyim olah v'zevach u'mincha u'levona, miviyei todah bet Adonai. Everything good will happen if you observe the Sabbath. But the imlo tishma'u, that is again a lift from Deuteronomy chapter 11. It's from that second paragraph of the Shema. The Kadesh et Yom HaShabbat, u'vilti se'et masa. And if you don't observe the Shabbat and sanctify it, Uvo b'sharei Yerushalayim b'yom HaShabbat, v'tzati ish b'shareha, there will be fire in the gates of Jerusalem, v'achla armenot Yerushalayim, v'lo tichbeh, and it will devour the palaces of Yerushalayim, and it shall not be quenched. The fire shall not be quenched. Those are real strong words. I wanted to get your reaction and talk a little bit about this. Yes.
How long after finding Safon found the Torah scrolls, how many years had elapsed before he was exhorting the people? And what widespread knowledge and background did the people have of the Torah scrolls? Where is the foundation that he is expecting from the people to have that dedication to, keeping all these precepts of Shabbos?
As usual, you're asking always good questions. This is probably a few years after the Reformation started, and I think you have a very good point, because after all, we know that he's preceded by Ammon, and before Ammon, Menashe. So for 50 years there had been no prophecy, there had been Shabbat. You can argue, have a little compassion, go slowly, a little Rachmanut. So, but Jeremiah, there was a strong side to Jeremiah, and when he saw that the Shabbat was not being kept, he said that this is something to be concerned about.
Was this parallel to the exile in Babylon, where he was cajoling the people to go along with it?
This is before it. We're now we're now considerably before that exile. Yes, yes.
Excuse me. Did the Reformation come when they found Devarim in the temple? Is that when the Reformation
Yes,
came?
that's when it started, in the 18th year of Yoshiyahu. He prophesies from the 13th to the 18th. There he talks about Judah's decay. We're now in the second piece of his prophecy after the Reformation starts, and he talks about Shabbat. And what this does is, and look, my whole rabbinate is a rabbinate where, in a certain sense, a rabbi is a salesman. I'm a salesman. I sell Shabbos, and I can tell you from all the stuff that I sell, the easiest stuff to sell is, guess what? Is Shabbos. Because the world really needs Shabbos. There used to be these bumper stickers that people had on their fenders, and it read, hang in there, Shabbos is coming.
Wow.
There's something very beautiful about Shabbat. Having said that, Jeremiah's doing stuff that in my rabbinate I've always tried, to the best of my ability, to be persuasive about keeping Shabbat. But I believe trying to be persuasive but never coercive. Expose people to ideas but never impose ideas. And I welcome whatever one does. In fact, I think one of my favorite scenes from that movie, Righteous Rebel, and I don't remember the story, was Phil Schneider tells the story that he's the one who put this movie together. And he tells the story that when he came to the community, that he came, it's on the film, so I guess I can talk about it. A lot of people have seen it. He says that, the joke that was going around in those days, I don't know if I've mentioned it here, what's the difference between a conservative and an orthodox? A conservative, okay?
I'll be fine.
Got water? My mother says, pick your hands up and
I'll
look
be
up.
fine, thank you.
What's the difference between a conservative and a reform shul on the one hand and an orthodox shul on the other hand? 2 blocks. So that's the joke that went around. And he always tried to park a little distance from the shul, and he tried to avoid 239th Street because he knows that that's where I crossed. Sure enough, I don't remember the story, but it tells the story that I was crossing 239th Street, and Phil had started coming to shul, and I see him, and he thought maybe he'll make the light. He doesn't make the light, so he's standing still at the red light. I look through the window and I see him, so I'm very proud that I knocked on the window. And he rolls down the window, and I lean in and I give him a big hug. Say, Phil, good Shabbos! It's a great, great moment.
And he said, from then on I observed the Shabbat.
But did he say that?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know.
The truth is, I'm not sure. I hope Yumio is not upset with me. I'm not sure this would be my style, but he talks about the importance of Shabbat. And Ein Mikra Yotzei Midei Pshuto. You can't take the text out of its literal meaning. He's talking about observing Shabbat. And when one reads Yirmiyahu, one has to read it honestly. And this is what he's saying. He is saying that, look, if you observe the Shabbat, the city will be saved, the Reformation will work, and if you don't, you're in a lot of trouble. And he's talking about Melachot Shabbat. He's talking about categories of work we're supposed to stay away on Shabbat. He's talking about carrying on Shabbat. Now we have an Erev, so you can carry within an Erev. He's talking about the Kiddashta, and you shall sanctify the Shabbat with the Kiddush, because Shabbat is not just a day that you don't do, Shabbat is a day that you will do. But I want to add something else. I think that Yirmiyahu picks Shabbat, and without taking away, because I would be dishonest if I took away from the literal meaning of the text. He is talking about the observance of the Shabbat and its importance. But I just want to add to it that the Shabbat has a special place in that its observance, in that either you could see it within the observance or separate from the observance. There is a powerful message of a deep meaning of what Shabbat is all about. It's a powerful message of Shabbat. You know, there's a movement, I've been told now, it's a movement that's getting around the world, and it's a movement which calls for disconnecting. It's like a disconnect movement.
Unplug.
Unplug. You got it. Unplug. And at first there was talk, one day a year, everyone should unplug. And then people were talking, why one day a year, maybe one day a month? Then somebody came up with the ingenious, novel idea, why once a month, why not once a week, unplug? And the idea is, I mean, I see it in the world today. It's hard to talk to somebody. Somebody's always on a phone. I mean, you're sitting down with somebody and you're having dinner,
They don't look at you.
and they're texting.
It's bad.
Meretzumir, talk to me. You know, come on. It's people are so glued into email and Twitter and this and that. I really don't. I'm very limited in my understanding of that. I could read a text. I can't send a text, but one day a week or one day a month, I think it's a very interesting idea to unplug. Let me just say this word, then I'm going to take your comment, okay? Just one. That's what Shabbat, Abraham Heschel says is about. Heschel was a great thinker. This was a serious man.
Yeah.
Heschel was, reading Heschel, was a genius. He's an absolute genius. What he wrote, I try to write books, articles, and then I look at what he wrote, my goodness sakes.
Yeah.
I mean, once you write, then you see how great this man was. He was prolific. One of the best works he wrote was on the Sabbath. And the story that's going around is that he was known as a writer that was poetic.
Mm-hmm.
So publishers thought, Dr. Heschel, if you would write a book about love, it would be a bestseller.
Mm-hmm.
And they asked him to write a book about love. And he said he'd think about it. He comes back a year later, and to cutesify the story, I'm not sure there is such a word, but to make it a little cute, he sits down with the publishers, I'm imagining the scene, and he says, my dear publishers, I've got good news and bad news for you. The good news is I wrote a book about love. The bad news is that the name of the book is The Sabbath. The publishers say, what does the Sabbath have to do with love? And Heschel says, the Shabbat is a day of love.
Yeah.
It's a day of love between God and his people.
Yeah.
And not only between his people, all people. And so I've written a book about the Shabbat.
Mm.
And his book was the first book I read in my life that impacted upon me profoundly. When I went to high school, I majored in basketball. That's what I did. And I wasn't a very good ball player. But when you play in the yeshiva league, if you're 5'4", you can be the center of the team. I used to take the cut sheet around. It'd take me too long to explain what the cut sheet was. Did it in 10 minutes. I had 40 minutes left in the gym. I could only shoot from the left side because at this never broken down gym, the basket was cut on the right side, so you could only play on the left side. I could only shoot from the left side. Since I was a righty, I used to shoot like this, like a crazy shot. And that's why I was a ball player. If my father finished Shabbat 1 minute late, boy was I upset. I used to stand with my basketball uniform running to my, I played varsity ball, whatever that meant. And if my dad finished Shabbat 1 minute late, I was very upset. By the way, I've since made up for it because I think I'm the rabbi who ends Shabbat the latest from everyone. And I think it has a lot to do with compensating with, I always thought that the best part of Shabbat was when it was over. Now the worst part of Shabbat is for me when it ends. Because Shabbat is the deepest expression of love between God and his people. It's certainly one of the deepest expressions. And I memorized Heschel's book. I memorized it many years ago. I still remember parts of the book. He writes, technical civilization is man's conquest over space. It's interesting, he uses the word man because he was an absolute feminist. He meant it generically, but that was the term he was used at. In technical civilization, what you try to do, and this is going back, I mean, think about technical civilization today, we're in a different world. But he writes then, technical civilization is the human being's conquest over space. What does space mean? That people want to be productive. You want to be productive in business, you want to build the building, you want to till the ground, you want to make money. So you try to conquer space. He means space in a poetic sense. And then he says, but in order to conquer space, you must expend time. You need time. You must spend time in order to succeed in conquering space. I don't mean reaching the moon, but in order to be business-wise successful. Then he has a sentence in which he says, and there's nothing wrong with making a living. Nothing wrong. Anecdotally, sometimes when I'm in Yerushalayim, they have this diagonal crossing on Yaffa Street. It's near the Haredi section. And it's the middle of the day. And hundreds of people are crossing the street with shopping carts. And I say to my wife always, sometimes I feel like standing up and screaming, does anybody work around here? It's Tuesday at 11 o'clock in the morning. So, there's nothing wrong with working. As a matter of fact, the Torah says on Shabbat you're supposed to rest. But it also says, guess what? 6 days you're supposed to work. So Heschel says there's nothing wrong and everything right in trying to succeed in space. But then he writes, and these are his words, but life goes wrong when the conquest of space becomes our sole objective. In other words, if all I do is use my time in order to conquer space, if in fact I live to do business rather than business be something that helps me live in a broader scale, something goes wrong. And then he has this glorious line, one of my favorite, those who have studied with me have heard me quote this many times. It's Heschel. Heschel writes, for to have more does not mean to be more. Yeah. To have more does not mean to be more. And for 6 days, I'm now looking at Shabbat conceptually, we're so involved in the world of having. On Shabbat, one tries to be involved in the world of being. For 6 days, we're involved in what I call the world of existence. On Shabbat, we try to be involved in the world of essence. For 6 days, we're involved in the creation of the outer world. On Shabbat, we're involved in the creation of the inner world. As a matter of fact, the Torah says, the first time it mentioned Shabbat, Vayichal Elokim Bayom HaShvi'i, and God finished his work on the 7th day. And when the Greeks had the rabbis translate that sentence, the rabbis were concerned. Because if they were to translate it directly into the Greek, that God finished his work on the 7th day, would imply that you could work on the 7th day. And miraculously, the story is, they were in 70 different rooms, and they somehow knew that that sentence would be, if translated directly, be a problem. Because during the Hellenist Greek time, maybe we would be coerced into working on Shabbat. And they each translated it, and God finished his work on the 6th day. But when you look in the text, that's not what it says. And it says, and God finished his work on the 7th day. And I'd like to argue, because the truth of the matter is, God did work on the 7th day.
Created Shabbat.
But the work on the 7th day was different than the 6th day. The object, that is the subject work, Dr. Norman Lamb puts it this way, the subject of work of the 6 days and Shabbat were the same, but the object of the work was different. For 6 days, the object was the outer world. On Shabbat, it's the inner world. The reason I had problems with Shabbat, it was presented to me by my teachers as a day of Neturnisht. You can't do this and you can't do that. I thought maybe on Shabbat I couldn't breathe. But when I really came to understand Shabbat, I understood that it's not about a cup that was empty. No, it was a cup that was full. There was so much beauty to Shabbat. So what I wanted to say is, without at all taking away from the Pshuto Shel Mikra, because Yirmiyahu was a tough guy, quote unquote. He was a prophet who spoke truth to power. And he felt there was no observance of Shabbat, and as my father said, he let him have it. He said it straight out, and he's talking about external observance, and that is critical. But what I am also saying is that he picked Shabbat because Shabbat is a ritual which is critically central to the prophet's understanding of a society that has a sense of mission and vision and values. I want to add one last point, and I want to take all your questions. I know that Estelle's going to attack me in a minute. She's plotting to attack me, but I just want to say this. I am not at all claiming, Estelle, that someone who doesn't observe Shabbat can't lead a full inner life. Of course one can. And by the way, I know many people who keep the externalities of Shabbat, who don't know the first thing about living a life of spirituality and meaning. I've said hundreds of times in my rabbinate, I know many observant people who are not religious, and I know many religious people who are not observant. I think the goal is to try to do both. All I'm saying is that Shabbat is a central piece. It's a central piece of recognition of the centrality of God, of the Heschel understanding of this love relationship between God and his people. And when he saw that Shabbat was not being observed, he saw something problematic in terms of ritual observance, in terms of commitment to God. Believe me, we're going to see in a moment that he also spoke about the basic ethical fundamentals, and he rebuked the people. You remember the text in chapter 5, Shotetu b'chutzot Yerushalayim, he says, look through Jerusalem. Can you find one person who does righteousness and justice? What did we say a couple weeks ago? That's a takeoff of Abraham saying to God, you can't find 10 righteous people in Sodom. He's saying you can't find one righteous, really righteous ethical person in Yerushalayim. So it's not that he's going to confine himself to talking Shabbat. He's also going to talk ethical principles. But he offers this rebuke, and in this rebuke was a teaching. was the hope. Now maybe you'll think it's tough love, but it was the hope, it was the teaching that people would truly reform, because he truly believed that if there would be reform in the spirit of the potter, that indeed he believed that the temple would one day not be destroyed. Yes, Estelle?
I have no objection with having a rest on the Shabbat. What I do have objection to are all the people who get around it, like the Shabbos light. You know, all of this mechanical stuff that God forbid you can't do on Shabbat when it takes a great deal of effort to push a button. I mean, I really have a problem with that. And yet, when the Ethiopians came to Israel,
Yes.
and they were not subject to all the wonderful mechanical gadgets that the Jews invented in order to get around observing the Shabbat, when it was dark, they sat in the dark. They didn't have a Shabbos
Right.
clock that put the light on. I mean, how do you justify all this
Right.
for well, you know what I mean.
I think you have a good point, Estelle. And there are two pieces to Shabbat. It's a delicate balance between the meticulous, fastidious observance, and that's what this stuff talks to, and to never forgetting its internal meaning. And I think whenever one uses these Shabbat clocks or whatever we use these days, I think one has to keep in mind what you're saying.
And you have the goyim pressing the button for the elevator.
Frankly,
it's
I actually
hypocritical.
You're
I
not
do that.
allowed to ask a guy.
I know,
I do that.
I know, but it is
I do that.
hypocritical.
I know, absolutely.
It's not their
Each to their
obligation.
own.
It's not their obligation.
But they know that you have to press the button,
They
because
stand
God
there, it's
forbid,
in our
you're
bills
doing
and-
a terrible thing on Shabbat. If you press a button, you're working very
No,
hard.
but let me just push back slightly. I mean, they could ask me to do things on Christmas that maybe they can't do. I've been trying, for example, in our building. I don't think I'm going to succeed, but these are Gentiles who who open and close the door. I have developed a real closeness to them. I said, well, they can't go to church on Christmas night. I said, I'll be the porter. I tried on the hat, the whole business. Right after this session, I have a call with the president of this co-op, and he says, first he said I could do it. He says, Rabbi, I think I got some union problems. I'm not sure what's around the corner. So whether I should just have done it, without asking any questions. But but I say that because there are times when I can step in and do things because I don't have a commandment relative to Christmas. They feel responsibility. During the Soviet Jewry days, Estelle, do you know what we did?
Yes.
I was arrested.
kids were
Here
involved.
we were outside of the 50th precinct today, and lauding the cops. There were 100 people there, and I was just kind of smiling because I walked in because got a little cold. I walked in with all the rabbis, and frankly, I'm the only one who really knew what the inside of that place looks like, because I know where the holding cells are, because I've been in those holding cells many times, because we were arrested on nonviolent civil disobedience for Soviet Jewry and later for Iranian Jewry many times. And there was an operation called Operation Redemption of getting arrested. But when it came to days like Yom Kippur, when we wanted to do it on a weekly basis, we couldn't get arrested. And so one of the great moments for us was when our Christian friends, I don't know if there were any Muslims, our Christian friends, I remember they were African American politicians, they said, you know what, we'll stand in. You can't do it, we'll do it. We'll press the button for you. And guess what? In the anti-apartheid movement, there were also many arrests. Christmas came, great moment. Guess what?
You press the button.
I pressed the button. There were many Jews who got arrested in that anti-apartheid. There were many arrests that were taking. I just want to put in a good word for that.
Yeah, very
I
interesting.
have no objection to all that. What I object to is people who well, you know what
Right.
it is. People who excoriate you because you're pressing a button. Granted, there is a quid pro quo.
Right.
But I mean, where is ending the rest? I know there's the idea that when you make electricity and it's supposed to change something, that is carrying it to the extreme,
Yeah, no, it
don't you
is.
think?
But there's been a lot of conceptual thought given to it. Probably the best work on it is Diane Grunfeld's The Sabbath, which I strongly recommend. Diane Grunfeld was a student of Shamshon Raphael Hirsch. His son actually prays in our synagogue. Rafi and Rafi is actually, his name is Shimshon Raphael. He was named after the great Samson Raphael Hirsch. His father, Diane Grunfeld, translated Hirsch's works, and if you've ever seen Rafi blow the shofar on Shabbat, on Rosh Hashanah, remember that big shofar and his talus?
Fantastic.
That talus is Hirsch's talus.
Wow.
That talus is worth a lot. I mean, he once told me how he got the talus, because there must have been a lot of people looking to get that talit. But Diane Grunfeld has a very interesting exposition on Shabbat. What he says is that it's a misnomer that on Shabbat you can't work and understand work as a concept of energy, but rather during the week human beings use their creative abilities, and we use it to such an extent that we come to believe that we are the creators and everything that has been accomplished is due to our brains, to our abilities. And what he argues is that it's important to step back to give recognition by not engaging in any creative work on Shabbat, to offer recognition that ultimately it is not we who are the masters of creation, but whatever we have been able to create is due to God. I mentioned this in shul recently, and someone came up to me who lives in Fieldston and told me something very interesting. Maybe if somebody's in Fieldston, you can check this off whether it's correct or not. This person told me that Fieldston is actually privately owned.
We know
Yeah.
that.
And you know that. And anybody can get into Fieldston except for one day a year. I think it's called, is it called eminent domain? I'm not sure. Maybe I have the wrong
In
legal
order to
term.
legally preserve that.
It legally preserves the private ownership.
Yes,
Like
they
Rockefeller
have to.
Center.
It used to be Rockefeller Center,
Oh,
which
that's
was owned by
one day.
Columbia University.
Yeah.
For one day.
It's sort of like God
Yeah.
saying,
Yeah.
this way his position is,
Yeah.
one day a week, let me legally preserve that, guess what, I'm the owner of this world, I'm the creator,
Yeah.
and the position of Diane Grunfeld is, it's good for people to recognize that whatever we've accomplished is because of a higher order. All I'm saying is that when you read Yirmiyahu, when you read it on its surface, it's like startling, oh my goodness. But given what Shabbat means, I could see how the prophet, when choosing a ritual to talk about that is a critical one, is going to talk Shabbat. It doesn't at all take away, as I said, from his speaking ethics. He talks about it. I'm not going to read it with you now because we've read it, chapter 5. But I want to move from this, from the Jeremiah who gave hope to the Reformation. And then we've now been talking about that while he hoped, he looked at what was happening and he couldn't control himself. He said, externally you're doing great, but internally you've got a long way to go. And the third step is that during this period of time, Jeremiah comes to be absolutely despised. He led a tough life.
Wow.
And Jessica, you've often told me this, you're correct. There is a tradition that when he was taken into the exile, that he was killed. That's the tradition. It's not in the text, to my knowledge, but that is the tradition. He is despised, and you can especially see this in chapter 18, sentence 18. When you say these words, you could be despised. You see, you have to understand this, that when he first started to prophesy, in the 13th year of Yoshiyahu, before the Reformation, and he got up there, people kind of wrote him off. But when the Reformation started and people thought that they were doing well, and he still pushes back so hard, then it wasn't just that he was written off. Then, at that point, this is a point made by Rabbi Bini Lau, at that point, he's not just looked upon like a kook who's written off, but he's a real person, and people really, really come to dislike him, to despise him. Let's look at chapter 18, sentence 18 for a moment. It is on page Page 129, yes there is. Let's take a look at this. Very important sentence. 18:18. Vayomru, and they said, Lechu v'nachshiva al Yirmiyahu. Come, let us devise devices against Jeremiah. Nachshiva al Yirmiyahu machshavot. Let's plan, let's think. What can we do to really hurt this man? You know what they say? If we get rid of him, we'll be fine. Ki lo tovad Torah mi kohen. It's not as if he is gone, we're not going to be able to learn Torah from a kohen. We have our priests. We don't need him. Even though Jeremiah, by the way, was a priest.
Yeah.
We don't need him. Ve'etza mi chacham. And it's not as if we're not going to be able to seek out advice from a sage. He's not the only one in town. V'davar mi navi. It's not as if we're not going to be able to hear the words of a prophet. Lechu v'nakehu v'lashon. Come, let us smite him with the tongue. The way I understand that really is not that we'll smite him with the tongue, but we're going to cut his tongue out.
Oh.
Yes, you could read it
Yeah.
that way. We will slander him.
Yeah.
We want to stop his tongue. Now you can look at the commentaries. I'm sure the commentaries are going to... Yeah, let's take a look at it. Page 129, the right-hand column, with the tongue. What does it say there? Michael, do you want to read it? Let us
Yes,
lay...
with the tongue. Just Michael?
Yes.
Okay. Let us lay charges against him which will encompass his
In
destruction.
other words, with our tongue,
Yeah.
we're going to slander him. That's one way. That's the
So that's the
target.
target,
Go
yeah.
on. The text may...
The text may mean with his tongue.
Okay. So the pshita, go on.
So
Let
the
us
pshita,
use...
let us use his own words to bring about his downfall through a charge of treason.
Now, right, because Jeremiah is going to be the person who is going to say to the king, we cannot stand up to the Babylonians. Now, a king could say that's treasonous. How dare you tell me that? We're going to use his own words to destroy it. I can turn this a little bit, and I say, V'nakeu balashon means, we'll cut his tongue out. Va'al nakshiva el kol dvarav. And we will not give heed, we will not listen, we will not give heed to any of his words. Let's get rid of him. And there is something that courses through the lives of prophets, and that is people didn't care for the prophets. They just didn't care. Elijah, what was he called? Ocher Yisrael, Achav called him. You troublemaker of Israel. Yehu and others were called Mishugah, the Mishugahim. Actually, when I was in my real activist days and people used to call me a troublemaker, I took that like a badge of honor. I mean, hey, if Elijah's called a troublemaker, what's so terrible in being called a troublemaker? Yes, Jessica?
Lashon means tongue, but Lashon means language.
Yes.
So I think it's more likely, it's let us smite him with language.
With language. Right.
Because this tongue is silly.
Yes. But I think, and just what you're saying is exactly as Michael read what the commentary is saying. With his language, with what he is preaching, let's go to the JPS, which is the best translation, 18:18. Come, let us strike him with the tongue. Interesting,
But
yes.
isn't it sort of an instinctive reaction that when somebody says something, you instinctively push back and you want to argue against?
Yes, it's right. Right. Look, I love telling the story that, lahavdil, that when I left St. Louis, my first pulpit, I was a young man, I was 24 years old, and I was invited to teach by Dr. Belkin at Yeshiva University. And they had a little going away party, and an old man Saul Mirowitz. He was 42 years old. I thought he was an old man. He gets up and he gives me a toast. He says, Rabbi, I want to bless you. You should have many enemies. So, I mean, after this little get-together, I went to him. I said, Saul, you're my friend. What are you blessing me that I should have enemies? Saul says, and I never forgot this, he's left this world now. He said, you know, Rabbi, I meant it as a blessing. Because if you do nothing, if you don't have enemies, you know what it means? You've done nothing. If you have enemies, it means you've done something. Now, I used to travel through St. Louis every 2 months to see Jonathan Pollard, who is the Israeli who's still in prison. I've not had contact with him now since 1997. At his request, he wanted the rabbi to come from Israel. But from 1988, August of 88 till December of 97, that's almost 10 years, every 2 months I would see him for 5 years in Marion, then he was transferred to Butner. So to get to Marion, Illinois, which is in southern Illinois, the closest airport is not Chicago, the closest airport is St. Louis. I'd land in St. Louis, I flew TWA, there is no TWA, I flew Wednesday night, because you had to get there 9 in the morning, there's no way to get there 9 in the morning, no plane goes there 9 in the morning, and then those days I drove 127.6 miles, but who's counting, to the prison. And so I decided, you know what, I'm going through St. Louis. I want to see my friend Saul Mirowitz. So I sit down with Saul, we have some coffee, he says, Rabbi, how are things, by the way, he looked much younger to me then. He was then about 62, but he looked much, much younger than 20 years earlier. He says, Rabbi, how are things going? I put my hand on Saul's, I say, Saul, I want to tell you something. I have fulfilled your blessing 100%. Got a lot of enemies, And, of course, this is tiny. We're talking here about the greats of the greats. They all struggle. He's despised. And when you think about it, the real greats, you take real risks. You know, Martin Luther King was a great man. It was, I'm sure in Las Vegas, the odds that something would happen to him, they were not small. They were big odds.
Yeah.
And whatever one thinks of Sadat comes to Israel.
Came to Jerusalem.
You do that kind of thing. Leadership is calling for change. The leadership gurus say leadership is calling for change. The prophet speaks truth to power and is calling for change. And guess what? People don't like to change. When you call for change, you know what people do? They push back. The leadership is trying to navigate the pushback. And you can read Yirmiyahu and different prophets at different tacks. Some were soft, some were hard. Yirmiyahu was pretty tough. I mean, there are some soft pieces. But he rebukes. And when he rebukes, he's very, very seriously despised. And in response, I just want to show you something. Yirmiyahu pushes back and says, now he's not just rebuking. He first of all starts in Anatot, which is his hometown. And he says, this city is going to be destroyed. Mm-hmm. And then he expands out to all of Israel. And he says, all of Israel is going to be destroyed. Let me show you these texts and I want to take your questions. Turn to chapter 11, sentence 21. We're in Anatot now. 21, 22, and 23. Let's take a look at what it says there. 21, 22, 23. It's on page 85. Lachen, therefore, Koama Adonai al anshe Anatot, hamevakshim et nafshecha lemor, lo tinaveh b'shem Adonai, lo tamut bi'adenu. Therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the men of Anatot, that seek your life, saying, you shall not prophesy in the name of the Lord, that you die not by our hand. Lachen ko amar Adonai tzvaot, hineni foked alehem. Therefore, he says, in the name of God, God will punish you. Habachurim yam, these are very hard words. Habachurim yamutu v'cherev.
Young men.
The young men will die by sword. B'neim uvnoteim. By the way, Yirmiyahu,
He wrote it.
look up the term Jeremiah. What's the translation of Jeremiah?
Jeremiah.
Jeremiah. And what does the word mean? I believe the word in English
Around.
means lamentation.
It's Lamentations of Jeremiah.
The Lamentations of Jeremiah. I actually think Jeremiah, you're the expert, I think it's sometimes associated with the word lamentation, even though, interestingly enough, the name Yirmiyahu means the opposite. It means to lift God, or God will lift me. But look at his words. These are the words of Eicha. He is the prophet who wrote Lamentations we read on Tisha B'Av. B'neim uvnoteim yamutu barav. Their children will die in the famine. Usherit lo tiyeh bahem. And they will have no remnant. Ki avi ra'ah el anshei anatot shnat pikudatam. I am going to bring evil on the men of Anatot. And then he spreads out this message. And if you'll take a look, please, at chapter 8, which is one of the toughest chapters in all of Jeremiah. Let's take a look at chapter 8 and read a couple of sentences, and then I'll take your questions. Chapter 8, sentence 4, page 61. Let's take it in the English. And let me take a look at it as we read it from the Cincino. I want to take a look at it in the JPS. I actually prefer the JPS translation. So let's read it inside. Is anybody who'd like, Elaine, would you like to read it? Sentence 4, chapter 8, sentence 4, yes.
Okay. Moreover, thou shalt say unto them, thus says the Lord. Do men fall and not rise up again? Does one turn away and not return?
So this sentence, what is he saying this sentence? He's saying, Hayiplu v'lo yakumu, im yashu v'lo yashu. Doesn't one have the capacity to turn things around? That's what he's saying. You fall, you get up. You make a mistake, you can correct the mistake. But he continues and says, while that indeed is part of life, that people can turn things around, I look out here and I don't see that happening. That's what Jeremiah says. Let's read it. Madua.
Why then is this people of Jerusalem slidden back by a perpetual backsliding? They hold fast deceit. They refuse to return.
Right. Madua shovava hamazeh Yerushalayim. Meshuva nitzachat. Hechaziku batarmit me'anu lashuv. Those last words, me'anu lashuv. They refuse to return. It's actually a play on the Jeremiah chapter 31 when Rachel says they will return. Me'anali inachem. Continue, please.
I attended and listened, but they spoke not aright. No man repents him of his wickedness, saying, What have I done? Everyone turns away in his course, as a horse that rushes headlong
In other
in
words,
the battle.
I've tried the best I could do. I tried to instruct them. I tried to direct them. I try to cajole them. I try to speak harshly to them. I'm getting no response. Right? He says, I've listened and heard. They do not speak honestly. No one regrets his wickedness. Ein ish nicham al ra'ato. In other words, if they don't regret their wickedness, they're just not turning things around. No one says, ma asiti. No one turns inward and says, what have I done? I noticed with what's going on in the city today, for weeks now, I spoke about this when I spoke about Eric Garner. The reaction when something like that happens is that everybody points a finger at each other.
What?
Well, I think it would be an interesting exercise for people to turn the finger inward, to be more self-reflective, and in a humble way ask, what can I do a little bit better? This is what he's saying. He's saying, I'm trying to offer them words, but he is saying here, nobody, what is his language here? He says in sentence He says in sentence 6, but
Everyone turns away.
everyone turns away. Now let's take a look at it, chapter 8, sentence 13 and 14. Now these are the words, Basof Asifim. This is the word which commences the Haftorah, the prophetic reading on the 9th of Av. So let's read sentence 13, very, very famous sentences because they're read then in 14. God says, now he's not just talking about Anatot, Asof Asifim Ne'um Adonai. It's, I can hardly read these words. I will utterly consume them, says the Lord. Ein anavim b'gefen. So there'll be no grapes on the vine. Ve'ein te'enim b'te'ina. And there'll be no figs on the fig tree. Ve'he'oleh novel, and the leaf is faded. Va'atein lahem ya'avrum. And I gave them that which they transgress. Ama anachnu yoshvim. Why do we sit still? This is a complicated sentence. The people say, why are we sitting still? Hey asfu. They say, let us come together. V'navo el areya mivtza. The people are saying, let's protect ourselves from the enemy. Let's go into the fortified city. V'nidmasham. I understand this to mean, and let us find some quietude there. Maybe we'll go indoors. We'll hide in some fortress and we'll be saved. Ki Adonai Eloheinu Hadimanu. But the Lord, Jeremiah says, in the name of God, God is going to silence us, v'yashkeni mei rosh, and he will give us water of gold to drink, ki chatanu l'Adonai, because we have sinned against the Lord.
We are always being told how terrible we are.
Okay?
Yeah.
All over the place, not just Yirmiyah.
You know, this
But
is,
was the fault in the method that Yirmiyahu used? He was constantly chiding. There was not. It was a message of doom and gloom. Could it be
That's a
if he had
Jeremiah.
tempered his words with a little uplifting?
Good. And that's what I want to end with, and then
How
we're
does
going to
he
light the
fin- yeah,
Hanukkah
how does he
candles.
finish?
I first want to show you really gloom, and then I want to show you how, well, you're absolutely right, but there was a strand in Yirmiyahu that was the prophet of hope, that did give hope. He's a complicated man, a complicated prophet. If you take a look for a moment at chapter 7, sentence 34, and this sentence will knock your socks off because, well, first of all, what have we done so far? We've spoken about different stages of Jeremiah's prophecy during the Reformation. First of all, there is the prophet of hope. That's chapter 18. That's the potter's sentences. Then there is the prophet of rebuke, the Sabbath, chapter 17. Chapter 5, the ethical ordinances. Then there is the Jeremiah who, because he rebukes, he is despised, chapter 18. And then there is the Jeremiah who pushes back and says to the people of Anatot in chapter 11 and to all of Judah in chapter 8, it'll all be destroyed. And if you look at the end of chapter 7, you know, under the chuppah, there are these famous words. The last bracha, the last sentence of the Sheva Brachot. Od, anybody know the words? Od Yishama ve'arei Yehuda v'chutzot Yerushalayim. We sing it. Od Yishama, which means soon they will be heard. Under the chuppah, this is what we say to the bride and groom. I love to sing this one. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher bara sason v'simcha chatan v'chala, gila rina ditza v'chedva, ava v'yachva, meira yishama b'arei Yehuda v'chutzot Yerushalayim, kol sason v'kol simcha. And we would sing, Od. Od means against all odds. Yishama b'arei Yehuda, they will be heard in the streets of Judah. Kol chatan. Right. I just finished this book on the Sharansky years, and I said that when Avital used to light Friday night candles in our home, she only used oil. It's a good segue to Hanukkah. I said, Avital, we use candles. She says, listen, every Shabbos for me is a Hanukkah. It's a hope for a Hanukkah miracle. I use oil. And by the way, to this day, he's been free 25 years already. She still uses oil on Friday night. It's really beautiful, because oil
Friday
was
night.
the fulfillment of a dream. And I used to look at her and I used to say on Shabbat, Od Yishama Barei Yuda v'chutzot Yushalayim, Kol Sason v'kol Simcha, Kol Natan v'kol Avital. One day they should get married. But look at the way it's found in Jeremiah. Look at this. The last sentence of chapter 7. Look at the sentence. This is quite something. Here it is. Sentence 31. Let's take it from 33 so you'll get it in its context. Let's read it inside. Anybody want to read it? Jessica, do you want to read it? 33? Take it in the Hebrew.
In Hebrew.
And in the English. And the carcasses.
And the carcasses of this people shall be food for the fowls of the heaven,
Pretty tough.
Wow.
and for the beasts of the earth, and none shall frighten them away.
Wow.
Go on. Now watch this sentence.
Then will I cause to cease from
To
the cities
cease.
of Judah, and from the streets of Jerusalem, the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, for the land.
Do you see what's
shall
happening?
be desolate.
This text in Jeremiah says the very opposite of what we say under the chuppah.
Well, we
today.
say under the chuppah the very opposite of what Yirmiyahu said.
Okay, you said it very well. In this text, this really takes it to its climax. What it says is v'hishbati. It's interesting, it's a play on the word
Shabbat.
Shabbat, but it's taking it, and I will cause to cease me'arei Yehuda mechutzot Yushalayim kol sason v'kol simcha kol chatan v'kol kala. In other words, there'll be no more joy, no more gladness, no more bride, no more groom. Ki lechorba tiyeh haaretz, because the whole land will be desolate, will be destroyed. Wow. But now I want to show you something. Because when you look at this, one would say, what we're doing under the chuppah is we're trying to say to Jeremiah 2,000 years later, it's actually more than 2,000, it's 2,500 years later, guess what, Jeremiah? We're going to fix it. You said that it would be destroyed then, and as a matter of fact, it turned out that you were right, but now we're rebuilding. And Jews were singing this song not just after the establishment of the state of Israel. This was found in the Sheva Brachot. For thousands of years, Jews were dreaming, Od Yishama. The word Od. Od, what does it mean? Od means
Still.
still, against
Still.
all odds. When Joseph reveals himself, he says, Ani Yosef, I'm Joseph. Ha'od Avichai, like against all odds? Is my father still alive? Ha'od Avichai? It's interesting, in the book that I write on the Soviet Jewry movement, the last paragraph is about that Joseph says to his brothers, Ha'od, is my father still alive? Ha'od Avichai? And in the Bible, there is no answer. The brothers are so stunned when they look at Joseph, they don't answer it. And I argue that in the last paragraph I write, the answer came when Soviet Jewry was freed, and when Soviet Jewry said, Od Avinu Chai, our father is still alive, Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live, and that became the theme song of the movement. But I want to show you something, in all fairness to Jeremiah, because he's a complicated figure. Here he's coming down so hard, Ishpati mechutzot Yerushalayim, no more joy, no more gladness, no more bride, no more groom. I don't want to leave it on that note. Take a look at chapter 33, sentence 11, and look at what Jeremiah says there. Chapter 33, sentence 11, 227. What does he say there? Let's take it from sentence 10. This you got to read this. We've not done enough of this. Page 226. We're ending with this. Ko Amah Adonai, thus says the Lord. Od is the other. Here's the Od. You all see it there? Od Yishama b'makom hazeh. They will still be heard in this place. Ashateh omrim chorevu. They will still be heard concerning this place, concerning which you say it is desolate. Me'en Adam, there is no human being there. Me'en Behemah, no animal. Barei, Jeremiah is saying. Now Jeremiah is at a different time, a little bit later saying, he's saying the opposite of what he said before. Uvechutzot Yushalayim hanishamot me'en Adam, ume'en Yoshev, ume'en Behemah. What does he say? Od Yishama, they will still be heard in sentence 11. Kol sason, v'kol simcha, kol chatan, v'kol kala. Kol omrim hodu et Adonai tzvaot ki tov Adonai ki le'olam chasto miviim toda bet Adonai ki ashuv et shvut haaretz kivarishona amar Adonai. Is this great stuff? Or is this great stuff? Look at the
He
English.
can't seem to make up his mind, he keeps changing.
Well, let's look at these two sentences. What does he say? Thus says the Lord, yet again there shall be heard in this place, whereof you say it is waste without man and without beast, even in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem, that are desolate without man and without inhabitant and without beast. Now this goes back to the beginning of the sentence. Yet again there shall be heard. What shall be heard in sentence 11? The voice of joy, and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, and the voice of the bride, the voice of them that say, give thanks to the Lord of hosts. ... And Estelle, you're right. When you say he can't make up his mind, what we have to do in the coming sessions is we have to see that Jeremiah is speaking at different times.
Isn't he foretelling
This
the future?
last piece, he actually says after he had been exiled to Babylonia. He's saying it at different times. At one point he says, in the piece that we read, this is during the Reformation, he says it's going to be destroyed. He says it even then. But later on, when he